Cannabis Cowboys, the forgotten history of weed in the Wild West. Picture the shelf behind the counter of a frontier druggist. Bandages, a tin of corn plaster, laudanum for the cough, and a row of small brown bottles. One of those bottles is cannabis. A tincture for pain, for sleep that would not come, for a woman's monthly cramps, and nobody in that dusty little town thinks twice about it. In the West, cannabis was not a crime. It was medicine you could buy on a Tuesday afternoon and carry home in your coat pocket. And the reason it was later turned into a crime had almost nothing to do with your health, and almost everything to do with fear. Subscribe and like. Here is the part of the story that got buried. Here is the whole arc in 2 lines, because it is stranger than the legend. In the cowboy era, cannabis was legal pharmacy medicine with no stigma on it at all. And the real story is how that ordinary frontier remedy got turned into one of the most feared words in the English language, not by doctors, not by science, but by a panic that arrived a full generation after the West had already closed. Start with the shelf. Walk into almost any pharmacy in America in the 1870s or 1880s, and you would find cannabis sold openly, under its own honest name. It came as a tincture, the dried flowers steeped in alcohol, poured into those little brown bottles and sold for pain, for cramps, for sleeplessness. The biggest drug companies in the country made it. Eli Lilly made it. Park Davis made it. Squibb made it. The same firms whose names still sit on medicine cabinets today once bottled cannabis and shipped it by the crate. It was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official book of recognized American medicines, from 1850 all the way to 1942. For nearly 100 years it was simply a drug. Approved, respectable, dull, and out in the fields it was even more ordinary than that. Hemp, the same plant grown for its fiber instead of its medicine, was a workaday crop across great stretches of the country. Kentucky grew it by the ton. Farmers cut it, dried it, and turned it into rope, sailcloth, and the rough fabric that held the frontier together. The wagons that rolled west were covered in hemp canvas. The ropes a cowboy threw over a steer might well have been hemp. This plant was not lurking in the shadows. It was in the barn, in the pharmacy, in the rigging of ships, hiding in plain sight as one of the most useful things a person could grow. So here is the part that should stop you. Nobody in the West, not the cowboy, not the doctor, not the sheriff, would have believed for 1 second that this plant could be illegal. The idea would have sounded insane to them, like outlawing willow bark or coffee. And the reason it became a crime anyway is uglier and more deliberate than most people have ever been told. That is the question this whole story has to answer. How did the most boring bottle on the shelf become public enemy number 1? To understand how strange the fall is, you have to understand how normal the plant was first. The frontier was a brutal place to be hurt. A man thrown from a horse, a woman in a hard labor, a child burning with fever, and the nearest real hospital might be 200 miles of bad road away. Medicine in that world was whatever the local druggist had on his shelf, and what he had was a short, blunt list. He had alcohol. He had opium and its stronger cousin morphine. He had cocaine, which a respectable doctor would prescribe without blinking. And he had cannabis. In that company, cannabis was actually one of the gentler things on the shelf. It did not stop a heart the way an overdose of morphine could. A frontier doctor reached for it the way a doctor today reaches for an ordinary painkiller. The knowledge had come west with the rest of 19th century science. An Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy had studied the plant in India in the 1830s and carried its medical uses back into the Western medical books, and from there it spread into American practice as a treatment for pain, for muscle spasms, for migraines, for the cramps of childbirth, and for the long sleepless nights that came with all of it. It was not a backwoods remedy either. It was prescribed at the very top of the profession. In England, the most respected physician of the day, Sir John Russell Reynolds, wrote in the medical press that for certain kinds of pain it was one of the most valuable medicines we possess. There is even a popular tale that Queen Victoria herself was given cannabis for her cramps. That last part the records do not actually prove, so treat it as a story rather than a fact. But the larger truth behind the story is real. The finest doctors alive thought this was good medicine. Picture how it actually moved through a household. A woman on an isolated ranch feels the first grip of a migraine she knows will flatten her for 2 days. She does not send for a doctor, because there is no doctor for half a day's ride. She goes to the cupboard, finds the brown bottle, and measures out a few drops onto a spoon of sugar or into a cup of water, the way the label and the druggist told her. An hour later, the worst of it has loosened its hold, and she is back on her feet. Because the work does not stop for a headache, multiply that small, undramatic moment by 1,000,000 kitchens, and you have the real place of cannabis in the West. It was not an experience, it was a chore made bearable. Doctors of the era trusted it for a long, specific list of troubles. They gave it for the searing pain of nerve damage, for menstrual cramps, for the convulsions of epilepsy, for the agitation that kept the dying from rest, and for plain stubborn sleeplessness. They argued in their medical journals about the right dose and the right preparation, the way doctors argue about any real drug, because the plant was uneven and a single batch could be stronger than the last. That unevenness was the worst thing anyone said about it. To the medical mind of the 1800s, cannabis was a tool, imperfect and a little unpredictable, but honest. Nobody was calling it a destroyer of youth. That accusation had not been invented yet. Now think about who was buying it out west. The trail hand with a knee that never set right after a fall. The rancher's wife worn down by a body that had carried 6 children in 8 years. The old prospector whose hands had locked up after years of cold water and rock. The asthmatic who bought medicinal cigarettes, sold openly in that era, that contained cannabis and were meant to ease his breathing. None of these people thought of themselves as taking a drug in the way we mean that word now. They were taking medicine, the same as a spoonful of cough syrup, handed across the counter by a man in an apron who had ordered it out of a catalog. And the catalog mattered. By the late 1800s, a frontier druggist could thumb through a wholesale list and order cannabis extract the same way he ordered bandages and tonics. It arrived labeled, dosed, and priced. There was no back room, no whisper, no shame. A small bottle might cost a fraction of a day's wages, well within reach of a working family. This was not a vice, it was a line item. And here is a detail worth pausing on because it kills a modern cartoon. The frontier did not run on stoned cowboys. Smoking the plant for pleasure was rare among the cattlemen and the settlers. Their cannabis went down by the spoonful, swallowed as a measured medicine for a real complaint, not lit up around a campfire. The Wild West was not high, it was simply medicated. The same dull way every hard-working place has always been. Hemp told the same story from the other direction. The fiber crop was so deeply woven into the young country that it had once half run on the stuff. The wooden warships of the early Navy were rigged with miles of hemp rope, and their seams were caulked with hemp fiber soaked in tar. On land, it became grain sacks, wagon covers, harness, and the rough clothing of people who worked for a living. Kentucky built an entire hemp country around the trade, with farms and rope walks turning the raw plant into cordage by the mile. A man growing hemp was no more suspicious than a man growing corn, and a good deal more useful when the rope ran short. By the time of the cowboy, the crop was already fading, pushed aside by cheaper fibers shipped in from overseas, but it faded the way old crops fade, into the background, not into a courtroom. Nobody burned a hemp field as contraband. They just stopped planting as much of it. So picture the whole thing together. A plant in the pharmacy, trusted. A plant in the field, depended on. A drug so respectable it sat in the official medical book of the United States for the better part of a century. That is where cannabis stood when the last open range was fenced and the cattle towns began to empty. Boring, legal, useful. So how does boring, respectable medicine become a national terror? To get there, the plant had to stop being American. It had to be made foreign. And that trick has a name. The West did not close in a single day, but by the early years of the 20th century, the open frontier was finished. The railroads had stitched the country shut. The great cattle drives were a memory. And in that newer, more crowded, more anxious America, the long, quiet life of cannabis as ordinary medicine began to change, for reasons that had nothing to do with the plant itself. The first thing that shifted was the country's mood about drugs in general. After decades of patent medicines secretly laced with opium and cocaine, sold to anyone with a coin, a backlash set in. A federal law in 1906 began forcing honest labels onto bottles. Another in 1914 clamped down hard on opium and cocaine. Cannabis got dragged toward the edge of that suspicion along with everything else, even though it had never left behind the wreckage that opium had. This was a real and understandable reckoning. The patent medicine business had genuinely poisoned the country. Soothing syrups full of morphine had been spooned into crying babies. Tonics that promised to cure everything had quietly hooked their buyers on cocaine. So when Americans turned against the secret drugging of that age, they were right too. The trouble was that cannabis got caught in the same net by association. not by any record of harm. It had been sold honestly under its own name with no great trail of ruined lives behind it. But once the public learned to distrust the bottle on the shelf, every bottle on the shelf inherited a little of that distrust. Cannabis was now standing in a lineup it had no business being in. But the thing that turned suspicion into hatred was not a medical discovery, it was a wave of people. In the 1910s and 20s, as revolution and poverty pushed families north across the border, Mexican immigrants arrived in the towns of the Southwest, looking for work in the fields and on the railroads. Some of them brought a habit that Anglo-America had barely seen before, smoking the dried plant for its effect rather than swallowing a measured tincture for a pain. And they brought a word for it: marijuana. That word did the heavy lifting. Cannabis had been the honest, clinical name on the pharmacy bottle for 100 years. Marijuana sounded foreign, strange, and other, and as the local newspapers and the early drug warriors picked up the new word, the old plant began to wear a new face. The same tincture a frontier mother had spooned out for cramps was, under its new name, recast as a sinister import that drove outsiders to violence and lured the young into ruin. Now, honest history demands a careful line here. Some accounts make this sound like a single villain sat down one morning and renamed cannabis on purpose, just to frame it as Mexican. The truth is a little more tangled. Marijuana was simply the common Mexican Spanish name for the smoked plant, and it would have arrived with the people who used it no matter what anyone wanted. But what is not in doubt is how that word got used once it landed. Officials and reporters reached for the foreign-sounding name precisely because it made the plant sound alien and threatening, and they tied it, again and again, to the very people they already wanted their readers to fear. You can see it in the timeline of the first bans, because the panic moved like a stain across the map. The earliest cannabis laws were not federal at all. They were state laws, and they started in the West and the Southwest, in the very places where the immigration was heaviest. California outlawed it as early as 1913. Texas and others followed through the teens and 20s. By the early 1930s, most states had banned it, and in town after town, the official reason given was the behavior of the newcomers, not the chemistry of the plant. The other group dragged into the panic were black musicians. Jazz was rising out of New Orleans and spreading north into the clubs of Chicago and New York, and cannabis moved with that music. To the men building the coming federal crackdown, that connection was not a footnote, it was ammunition. The plant could now be hung around the necks of two groups that frightened the white public of the day: Mexican laborers in the West and black performers in the cities. The medicine itself had not changed by a single molecule. The story told about it had been rebuilt from the ground up, and it had been rebuilt out of prejudice. You can hear the machinery in the language itself. The scare stories did not argue with the old medical view. They simply ignored it and spoke instead of crazed strangers, of crime waves, of a weed that supposedly turned quiet people into killers. There is a popular theory that goes further still, that a small ring of wealthy industrialists engineered the whole ban to crush hemp and protect their own products. The hard evidence for that grand design is thin, and careful historians treat it with caution, so it is fair to leave it as a suspicion rather than a fact. What needs no theory at all is the plain pattern in the newspapers. The plant was foreign now. The users were people to be feared, and fear, printed every single morning, hardens fast into common sense. By the early 1930s, the ingredients were all in place: a foreign-sounding name, a drumbeat of newspaper scare stories, a public primed to believe the worst about the people the drug had been pinned to. All it needed now was a man with a federal badge and a real talent for fear. His name was Harry Anslinger. In 1930, the United States created a new agency called the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, and Anslinger's was made its first commissioner. He was a hard, ambitious bureaucrat running a small, new office in the depths of the Great Depression, an office that needed a reason to exist and a budget to match. Cannabis, freshly renamed and freshly feared, was the cause that could hand him both. What Anslinger built was not a medical case. It was a propaganda machine, and it ran on stories. He kept a file of lurid crime reports that he and his agents blamed on the drug, a grim scrapbook later known as the Gore Files, and he fed them to a hungry press. He paired them with public statements so soaked in racial fear that they are hard to read today, tying the plant openly to Mexican immigrants and to black jazz musicians, and warning that it made the people who used it dangerous to white society. This was the engine of the crackdown, stated out loud, not evidence, Race, the most infamous of his stories, concerned a young man in Florida who killed members of his own family. Anslinger told the country that marijuana had driven him to it. What Anslinger left out was that the young man had a long, documented history of severe mental illness, and that no real link to the drug was ever established. The truth did not matter, the headline did. This was the era of a film called Reefer Madness, released in 1936, in which a single puff sends clean young people spiraling into madness, violence, and death. It was nonsense, and it was effective. The big newspaper chains of the day, hungry for sensation, ran the scare stories on their front pages, across print, radio, and the new power of the motion picture. Americans were taught to be terrified of a plant their own grandparents had bought across a pharmacy counter without a second thought. The campaign had a target, and in 1937 it hit it. Congress passed the Marihuana Tax Act. Written deliberately under the foreign-sounding name, on paper it was only a tax, a heavy and tangled set of rules and stamps wrapped around growing, selling, and prescribing the plant. In practice, it was a strangulation. The paperwork was so punishing, and the penalties for a mistake so severe, that legitimate medical use simply collapsed. A doctor could no longer reasonably hand out what a frontier doctor had handed out for 50 years. The cowboy's medicine was, for all practical purposes, finished, and here is the detail that gives the whole thing away. When the bill was being debated, the American Medical Association sent a man to testify against it. Dr. William Woodward, a physician and a lawyer for the association, stood up before Congress and objected. He pointed out that there was no real evidence cannabis was the menace the newspapers claimed, and that the law would cut doctors off from a medicine they had used responsibly for generations. The country's own organized physicians were telling Congress to slow down. They were brushed aside. The science was in the room, raising its hand, and the panic won the vote anyway. It is worth sitting with how fast and how thin the whole thing was. The hearings that decided the fate of a century-old medicine were brief. Some of the doctors who might have objected did not even realize in time that the strange new word marijuana in the bill meant the familiar cannabis on their own shelves. By the time the medical profession grasped what was being outlawed, the votes were nearly counted. A drug that had taken 100 years to earn its place in American medicine was pushed out the door in a matter of months, on the strength of newspaper stories and a bureaucrat's ambition. That is the heart of it. The ban did not come from the laboratory. It did not come from a pile of dead patients or a sudden discovery that the medicine was poison. It came from a bureaucrat who needed an enemy, a press that needed a villain, and a public that had been carefully taught which faces to attach to its fear. By 1942, the plant was quietly dropped from the United States Pharmacopoeia, erased from the official book it had sat in since 1850. The medicine had not failed. It had simply been outvoted. And think about what that quietly cost. A doctor who had reached for cannabis to ease a patient's pain or calm a patient's spasms now reached for something else, or for nothing at all. The remedy did not disappear because something better had replaced it. It disappeared because handling it had been made too dangerous for an honest practice, but the lost medicine was not even the worst of it. The worst was the lost truth. A whole country was taught a history that never happened, taught that this plant had always been a foreign poison creeping at the edges of decent life. The boring brown bottle, the frontier mother's spoonful, the rancher's bad knee, all of it was scrubbed out of the public memory and painted over with a monster. The stigma outlived every single person who built it. In a great many places, it is standing still. So look back at that frontier pharmacy shelf one more time. The small brown bottle of cannabis tincture sitting between the bandages and the laudanum was not a loophole, and it was not a frontier eccentricity. It was the normal state of things, the honest center of the story, for the entire life of the Wild West. The plant was legal because there was no reason on earth for it not to be. It eased pain, it brought sleep, it grew into rope and cloth. The cowboy, the doctor, and the sheriff all lived their whole lives in a country where this was simply quietly true. What changed was not the plant. What changed was who America had decided to be afraid of. A generation after the last cattle town went silent, a new century looked at the same harmless bottle, gave it a foreign-sounding name, tied it to the immigrants and the musicians it already distrusted, and handed it to a man who knew exactly how to turn fear into law. The medicine that had crossed the plains in a druggist's catalog was beaten, and it was not beaten in a hospital. It was beaten in a hearing room. So the next time you hear the word marijuana spoken as if it has always meant crime, Remember that for almost the entire time there was a Wild West, it meant the opposite. It meant relief on a hard shelf in a hard country. The cowboys' medicine did not fall because anyone ever proved it was dangerous. It fell because a later generation needed something to be afraid of, and it lost the fight.